The train screeched to a halt, its iron wheels shrieking against the tracks like a wounded animal gasping its final breath. Steam billowed into the brittle evening air, thick and acrid, clinging to Jasper Holt's weathered face as he stood motionless on the cracked platform. His boots, caked with dust from a lifetime of dry seasons, were planted wide apart, as though bracing against the weight of his own despair. The sun slouched low, casting a blood-orange glare over the desolate station, a sagging wooden shack with warped boards splitting at the edges, its corners choked with dust that clung like cobwebs of forgotten time. The air was heavy with the stench of scorched metal, rotting wood, and the suffocating hollowness of a place where hope had long since withered. Jasper knew this smell too well. It had followed him home from the fields, where his ranch's parched soil now mirrored the cracked riverbed he once called fertile. His wife Mary's ghost lingered in every shadow, her absence a raw wound beneath the scab of 2 winters past. Time hadn't healed him. It had only buried the ache under layers of grit and silence. The train doors clattered open, and a handful of passengers spilled onto the platform. Travelers with hollow eyes and weary steps, their lives etched in the dust of their own journeys. Jasper's gaze drifted over them, half expecting nothing to change. Then she appeared. A figure emerged from the shadows of the train car, her silhouette wavering like a mirage. Her dress, once ivory muslin embroidered with faded blue flowers, hung in tatters, stained dark near the shoulder, a stark contrast to the pallor of her skin. Blood seeped from a gash at her temple, trickling down her cheek in a crimson thread, mingling with grime. Her bonnet tilted askew, casting a fractured shadow over eyes wide with terror. She staggered forward 2 faltering steps, then collapsed. Before Jasper could process the sudden lurch of his heartbeat, his boots were moving, crossing the platform in 3 long strides. He caught her just as her body crumpled, her slight frame pressing against his chest like a broken bird. She was all angles and bruises, her breath shallow and trembling against his coat. Her lips moved, brushing his ear with a whisper that cut deeper than any blade. "Please don't let him find me." The words froze him, their weight heavier than the rifle he carried. Who was him? The question clawed at his throat, but there was no time. Around them, murmurs rose. A cluster of townsfolk had gathered, their faces twisted with curiosity and judgment. Poor thing. Ain't proper for her to be alone like that. Jasper straightened, cradling Hannah tighter, his glare silencing the whispers like a shutter slamming shut. Sheriff Hollis would come soon, asking questions Jasper didn't want to answer. For now, there was only this, the fevered warmth of her skin, the tremble of her hands clutching his coat, and the gnawing realization that whatever danger she'd fled had just become his own. As he adjusted her weight in his arms, Jasper felt it, a flicker in his chest, ancient and dangerous, like embers stirring beneath ash. He buried this feeling with Mary, convinced it had died with her. But here it was, clawing its way back to life. The raw, unrelenting need to protect, to fight, to live. The station's shadows stretched longer, swallowing the last light as Hannah stirred, her lashes fluttering like moth wings. Her terror met his resolve, and in that moment, Jasper understood. This stranger in his arms wasn't just a mystery. She was a reckoning, and the world that had carved him from grief and dust was about to learn he wasn't as hollow as it thought. The preacher's Bible snapped shut with a dull thud, sending a puff of dust into the air that shimmered briefly in the waning light. The sound carried a strange weight, like the final crack of a rifle echoing through the cramped station house. The words husband and wife still lingered between the wooden walls, sharp and unresolved, as if the building itself wasn't sure what had just transpired. Jasper reached out and helped Hannah to her feet, his grip steady despite the tremor in her fragile hand. Her fingers felt brittle against his, bones thin beneath skin that bore the stains of grief and violence. Outside, the last of the sun melted into the horizon, the sky bleeding shades of rust and flame, as if the heavens themselves mourned what had been done. Their wagon stood waiting by the edge of the tracks, its frame worn and slumped from age and heat, the leather reins limp over the mule's withers. Jasper guided Hannah up onto the seat, his hand pausing at her elbow a moment longer than necessary, steadying her as she shifted. She winced, not from the sharp bloom of pain that flared beneath her bruises, but from a sensation of every eye in town crawling across her skin. The townsfolk had gathered in silence, their silhouettes tucked into alleys and behind shutters, watching with suspicion and quiet condemnation. A widow, remarried before the dust, had even settled on her first husband's grave, a girl marked by blood, fear etched in her posture. Even the sheriff's stiff nod felt less like approval and more like a sentence passed. Hannah stared at her lap, hands clasped tightly as the wagon began to move. The mule plodded forward, hooves thudding against the dry earth in a slow, hollow rhythm, and each jolt sent a fresh wave of ache through her battered frame. Jasper kept his eyes on the road ahead, his jaw tight, his silence louder than any words. Something inside him shifted, something that had been teetering since morning and now finally fell. This wasn't a gesture of goodwill. It wasn't duty or charity. It was a wager, silent and high-staked, made in the half-light of morality and desperation. The wind rolled through the open plains, carrying the scent of trampled grass and far-off rain, but none of it cleansed the copper tang on Jasper's tongue, the regret he couldn't swallow down. He didn't know if this was penance or if self-preservation, and that not knowing cut deeper than any truth. When Hannah finally spoke, her voice was threadbare, stretched thin by fear and exhaustion. "Why marry me?" she asked, the words barely more than breath, yet heavy enough to press against his ribs like iron. Jasper's hands tightened on the reins, the leather groaning under the strain, an echo of a sigh from someone long dead. His answer came slow, gravelly, like a truth dragged through the dirt. "And about worth," he said. "It's about doing what's right." But even as the words passed his lips, they soured in his mouth. Right. It should have felt noble, clean, but it didn't. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, blindfolded, with no way back and no idea what lay below. The ranch emerged from the horizon like a memory half forgotten, its fences slouched and its barn leaning as if weary from holding itself up all these years. This was home, or what remained of it. Hannah pulled his old coat tighter around her shoulders, and though the act was small, simple, it stirred something inside Jasper that he'd tried to bury. A sense of duty laced with longing. Guilt wrapped in the fragile skin of something close to hope. He hated it, and he feared it more, because Mary's ghost still lived in the corners of that ranch, and now another woman, bruised, broken, and far too young to carry this much sorrow, was stepping into the same haunted place. Was he saving her from the world, or chaining her to a new kind of ruin? As the wagon rattled through the gate, dust swirled behind them, catching the last of the sunlight and hanging in the air like ash. Jasper didn't glance her way. Couldn't. His jaw was set, his eyes forward, but in the pit of his bones he felt the truth. This wasn't a rescue. It wasn't redemption. It was a deal. A silent one, made with ghosts and shadows. A deal with the devil. And somewhere just beyond the threshold, hell was already knocking. Dawn broke like a held breath finally exhaled, the light creeping across the prairie with the slow certainty of fate. But there was something off about the morning. It wasn't the cold or the quiet, but the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, too perfect. No birds chirped, no wind stirred the long blades of grass outside. The air was dense, metallic, humming with an unseen threat. It pressed against the walls of the ranch, like a warning unspoken. Jasper sat up slowly, the bed creaking under his weight, his boots thudding hollowly on the floorboards as he rose. He felt the tension before he saw it, his fingers already curling around the rifle as he made his way to the front window. The glass was streaked with grime, but he could still make out two figures standing by the barn, silent, unmoving. They weren't passers-by or curious drifters. They stood like predators who'd been tracking their prey through long nights and longer regrets. The sight of them made the hairs on Jasper's neck lift. They had returned. He turned away quickly, a cold knot forming in his chest. Hannah's door was ajar, the faint creak of its hinges echoing through the hollow house like the ticking of a clock running out. The room beyond was empty. A shot of panic lanced through Jasper, sharp, immediate, unforgiving. He opened his mouth to call for her, but the sound died in his throat. Then, just barely, he heard it, a faint rustle near the kitchen. He pivoted and found her there, crouched beneath the window, her body taut with fear. Her hands trembled around the handle of a battered revolver, far too big for her slender fingers, but her grip didn't falter. Her face was pale as ash, lips parted, eyes locked on his. There was no need for words. They found me, hung in the air between them, silent but undeniable. He saw in her face, in the way she shook but didn't break. The past had come knocking, it hadn't come alone. Then a voice shattered the fragile silence, loud and coarse, like gravel scraped across rusted metal. "Holt, we ain't looking for trouble. Just hand over the girl." The drawl was followed by the distinct sound of spitting, a deliberate mark of disrespect. "She's promised to a man what paid good money for her. You don't want to cross him." That one word, paid, slithered through Jasper's thoughts like a snake, curling tight around something deep and ugly. Paid, not loved, not chosen, bought, owned. His jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening around the rifle stock as if trying to hold the very world together. This wasn't a story of love lost. This was a transaction interrupted. Hannah wasn't a woman to them. She was merchandise. He didn't hesitate. Motioning toward the back, his voice came low, harsh. "Stables. Stay low." She didn't move at first, her gaze dropping to the revolver as if weighing its worth against the storm at the door. Then, with a determined nod, she disappeared into the shadows, her bare feet whispering across the floor. Jasper moved to the front, planting himself like a post driven deep into the earth. Through the dusty glass, he watched one of the men dismount. His spurs jingled with every step, a cruel melody of confidence. His partner stayed on the horse, scanning the house with a false casualness. It was the look of someone who'd done this before and didn't expect resistance. "You got one chance," the man barked again. "Hand her over." Jasper said nothing. He didn't have to. Every scream Hannah had swallowed, every scar on her back, every ounce of fear she carried like a second skin. He felt it now, boiling beneath his ribs. The rifle fired once, a clean shot, the bullet biting into the dirt just inches from the rider's boots. A warning, not a miss. The man stumbled, swearing as he reached for his weapon. Jasper's second shot was sharper, meaner. It clipped the man's hat, sending it spinning into the dirt. Behind the house, Jasper heard the sound he was waiting for. Hooves, fast and frantic. Hannah was running. The mounted man wheeled his horse toward the back, aiming to intercept her. Jasper didn't think. He moved. The door flew open, the rifle raised. The rider spotted him too late. One shot, sharp, practiced, precise, and the man crumpled from his saddle, hitting the earth with a dull thud. The horse bolted, disappearing into the rising sun. The first man didn't even look back. He ran, leaving his partner sprawled in the dust. Cowards, Jasper thought. Cowards with bullets in their pockets and blood on their hands. As he sprinted toward the barn, Hannah burst into view, her skirt clutched in both fists, her breath hitching, hair streaming wild behind her. She collided into him, tears tracking through the dirt on her cheeks. "They won't stop," she rasped, her voice hoarse from fear. "He'll send more." Jasper caught her by the shoulders, steadying her, forcing her to meet his gaze. Her eyes were wide, still glassy, but underneath the terror, he saw it. That ember of resistance. That stubborn, smoldering spark. She wasn't just a girl running from danger. She was a woman taken against her will, a name on a ledger that had no right to hold her. And the men chasing her, they weren't hunting for love. They were reclaiming what they believed they owned. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sweat, earth, and the faint, bitter tang of gunpowder. Jasper gripped the rifle tighter. Let them come, he thought. Let every ghost from Hannah's past ride through hell to get here. He had made a choice. A dangerous, irreversible choice. He'd traded solitude for fire, and he wasn't about to run from the blaze. If the devil wanted her back, he'd have to take her from a man who had nothing left to lose. Together, they walked back toward the house, their shadows long and sharp in the morning light. But Jasper felt no fear now. The West was a land built on reckonings, and today it had two names to remember, his and hers. The rider's horse charged toward the barn, hooves pounding against the hardened earth with relentless force, each beat echoing like the prelude to a storm. Dust billowed in swirling clouds behind it, a curtain of chaos in the morning light. Jasper stood firm, unmoving. His heart didn't race. His breath didn't falter. The rifle in his hands felt like an extension of his will, and when he pulled the trigger, it was with clarity born of purpose. The shot rang out, sharp, decisive. The bullet found its mark, tearing the rider from his saddle with brutal efficiency. The man's body hit the ground with a hollow, lifeless thud, limbs folding beneath him in a twisted sprawl. The horse, spooked and riderless, galloped into the horizon, its silhouette swallowed by the rising sun, a silent witness to retreat. Jasper's eyes flicked to the other man, the leader. He stood midway between action and panic, caught in the split-second grip of decision. His hand hovered near his weapon, but only for a breath. Then he turned tail, running without shame or farewell, his boots flinging dust in his wake as he vanished over the ridge. Jasper watched him go, jaw clenched. Cowards, they always fled when alone. But he knew better than to count the fight over. Cowards like that didn't forget. They didn't forgive. And they didn't stop. Inside the house, the air smelled of smoke and lavender, an odd but comforting blend. It clung to the walls like a memory. The hearth had been cleaned to a shine, the scent of scorched ash replaced by something gentler. Hannah had worked quietly but with clear intention, scrubbing, sewing, bringing order back to a place long surrendered to decay. Her hands bore the evidence, reddened knuckles, pinpricked fingertips, yet still they moved with grace, with purpose. At some point, a soft hum drifted from her lips. The tune, faint and unfamiliar, floated through the cracks in the walls and into the fading light, more haunting than cheerful. Jasper stood in the doorway, rifle still slung at his shoulder, and listened. The melody brushed past him like wind across wheat, filling the hollow corners of the house, and something deep inside him stirred. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even pain. It was something rarer, something he hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Hope. Fragile and terrifying, it crept in quietly, laced into the way she moved, the way she stitched, the way she sang. But the land wasn't fooled. It never was. By midday, the illusion of peace cracked. Jasper spotted the first warning, a snapped fence post near the road, too clean to be the work of livestock or weather. His fingers traced the wood's splintered edge, eyes scanning the dirt until he found them. Boot prints, faint but deliberate, circling like wolves on the edge of firelight. The trail looped wide, leading toward the river, then arcing back toward the house. Someone had been watching. Close, patient. Jasper's face hardened. He filled his coat pockets with extra shells, every movement measured, quiet. Preparation became ritual, his way of telling the land, the shadows, the waiting silence. Not today. When he showed Hannah the tracks, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her shoulders lifted slightly, her spine straighter, but her hands, still wrapped around the newly sewn curtains, trembled just enough to betray her fear. She finished hanging them anyway, forcing calm into her gestures. Later, she folded clean linens with the same quiet resolve and lit a candle on the hearth, as if a single flame could push back everything that stalked just beyond the dark. That evening, they sat together at the table, neither touching the other, neither saying much. The stew between them was warm, but the silence had weight. Every glance at the window, every creak of wood, every gust of wind carried the same question. When will they come back? Outside, the prairie stirred. The coyote's cry rose thin and far, a note of hunger drifting through the still air. Jasper placed the rifle by the door, its presence a silent promise. Hannah slept with the revolver beneath her pillow, fingers curled tight around it, even in sleep. The house no longer echoed with emptiness. Now it listened. It waited. The wind brushed against it like a breath on skin. The walls groaned softly, alive with tension. And somewhere beyond the ridge, just past the edges of light and fire, the land held its breath. The shadows had not retreated. They had only stepped aside, watching, waiting. The sky had bled itself dry, draining every last drop of light until only a bruised twilight remained. It hung low over the land, heavy and expectant, as if the horizon itself held its breath. 3 riders crested the distant ridge, their dark silhouettes etched sharply against the dying glow. No sheriff rode in behind them. No curious neighbors peeked through their windows. This was no call for justice. This was personal. It was the past returning with fists clenched and blood in its mouth, clawing its way across the dirt toward the house where Jasper and Hannah stood, not as victims anymore, but as something harder. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of flour, sweat, and something unspoken. Hannah stood at the kitchen table, her hands steady as she rolled dough in slow, deliberate arcs. The wooden pin thudded in a rhythm like a heartbeat, repetitive, grounding, protective. Outside, the storm was taking shape, but in that moment, her focus was absolute, as though the simple act of baking might hold the chaos at bay. Then Jasper's voice cut through the hush like a blade drawn from a sheath. Low, rough, and certain. They're here. Hannah didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. The rolling pin stopped in its path, and she turned toward him, her gaze locking with his, all trace of fear stripped clean. There was only clarity in her eyes, a kind of fierce stillness. Without a single word, she reached for the rifle propped against the wall, her fingers closing around the stock with the easy familiarity of someone who had long ago made peace with violence. She checked the chamber. The motion was smooth, almost graceful, too practiced to be born from recent necessity. This was muscle memory. This was survival. Together, they moved to the front window, their rifles heavy in their hands, not as burdens, but as anchors. Beyond the sagging fence, the riders approached, dust swirling around their boots. The leader dismounted first. Jasper saw him clearly now. The face that haunted Hannah's nightmares stood flesh and blood beneath the darkening sky. His coat hung loose over a blood-streaked vest, his sneer curling like smoke, bitter and poisonous. His men fanned out behind him, each with their hands twitching near their holsters, poised for violence. Then his voice shattered the stillness, loud, crude, and brimming with venom. "You got something belongs to me, Holt." Jasper's fingers tightened around the rifle's grip, knuckles whitening. His reply was calm, cold, and absolute. "She ain't property," he called back. "She ain't yours." The words cut clean, like a brand being burned across the air. The leader laughed, sharp and bitter. "She sure as hell ain't yours neither." It was then that one of the men began to flank the house, creeping through the dirt with purpose. The moment cracked open. A single shot rang out. Hannah's rifle barked like thunder, and the man dropped where he stood, the bullet tearing through his chest and silencing his steps forever. What followed was chaos. Jasper fired, his rifle erupting with violent certainty. The leader staggered, clutching a shoulder now slick with blood, the dark stain blooming across his coat like a death flower. One of the remaining riders turned and ran, kicked into motion by the sheer, raw force of a resistance he hadn't expected. They had come to reclaim, to punish, but now they found themselves hunted instead. The last man froze, gun half raised, his mind caught in the teeth of uncertainty. Hannah stepped onto the porch. The revolver in her hands didn't waver. Her breath was steady, eyes locked. She said only one word, soft, unwavering, "Run." And he did. He didn't look back. Jasper crossed the yard slowly, his rifle still at the ready. The ground crunched beneath his boots, stones and grit shifting with each step. The leader writhed in the dirt, one hand clutching his ruined shoulder, the other clawing at the earth like it might somehow anchor him. His face was twisted, not just with rage, but with something deeper, fear. Jasper knelt beside him, the barrel of his rifle resting lightly against the man's thigh. Not yet pressing, but promising. "You come back," he said, his voice like winter wind scraping bone. "I won't miss." The man met his gaze with a hatred so intense it burned, but his mouth said nothing. He gritted his teeth, dragged himself back to his horse, and climbed into the saddle with a grunt of pain. Blood stained his side like a badge of failure. With a final, bitter glare, he turned and galloped after the others, vanishing into the falling night. The silence that followed was almost unbearable in its weight. It pressed down on the house, on the land, on the two figures left standing beneath the eaves. Hannah lowered the revolver with care, her hands beginning to shake now that the storm had passed. Jasper returned to her side, his eyes scanning the empty horizon. The prairie stretched out in all directions, vast and breathless, but the quiet carried no comfort. Something lingered, a promise, unspoken but heavy as stone. This wasn't the end. Not for the man nursing his wound, not for the two who'd fled, and certainly not for Jasper and Hannah, whose names would now stir the dust in every saloon whisper and every sidelong glance for miles. Inside, the glow of the oil lamp cast soft shadows across the room. Hannah lit it with slow hands, anchoring herself to the small rituals of peace. She pressed a hand to her temple, the tremor fading as she drew a breath and steadied her spine. Jasper watched her closely, the way she stood straighter now, the way her eyes no longer darted toward every creak and whisper. She met his gaze, her voice quiet but unshaken. "They'll come again," she said. Jasper nodded, slipping fresh shells into his coat pocket with steady fingers. "Let him," he replied. "They'll find we're not so easy to take." Outside, the wind moved through the prairie like a slow breath, brushing the tall grass, whistling through the broken slats of the old fence. It carried the scent of gunpowder, the sting of blood, and something harder to define, defiance. Jasper and Hannah stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the porch light, two figures carved from survival, no longer haunted by their ghosts, but ready to face them. The night closed in, cool and vast, but it was not a blanket of rest. No, the storm was not over. It had only just begun to gather. The scar on Hannah's temple faded into a pale, silvery thread, a ghost of the violence that had once stained her skin. The fear in her eyes, the wide-eyed terror that had clung to her like dust, softened, replaced by a quiet steeliness that Jasper recognized in himself. She moved through the house now with a purpose that felt almost sacred, her hands steady as she kneaded dough in the early morning light. Dawn seeped through the patched curtains, painting the kitchen in gold, the warmth spilling over her fingers as she worked the flour and water into something solid, something whole. The humming began again, faint at first, then stronger, a melody that curled through the rafters and filled the hollow spaces where silence had once ruled. It was a sound Jasper hadn't realized he'd missed until it was there, a lullaby for the living, not the dead. They rebuilt the house plank by plank, nail by nail, their labor speaking louder than any vows they'd muttered in the station house. Jasper patched the sagging fence posts, his hands blistered and calloused, while Hannah scrubbed soot from the hearth until the bricks gleamed like new. She mended curtains with delicate stitches, her needle dancing over torn fabric, and straightened crooked picture frames that had leaned askew for years. Jasper watched her from the doorway sometimes, his throat tight. As he took in the way, she pressed her palm flat against the table, as if grounding herself in this fragile, reborn world. There were no grand declarations between them, no promises of safety or certainty. But in the quiet rhythm of their days, something unspoken grew, a bond forged in shared survival, in the slow, stubborn act of choosing to stay. Yet the ghosts lingered. At night, the house breathed differently, its creaks sharper, its shadows deeper. Hannah slept with the revolver tucked beneath her pillow, its weight a familiar anchor against the dark. Jasper kept rifle shells by the door, his boots near the bed, ready for the nightmares that still clawed at the edges of sleep. They never spoke of the riders who had come and gone, the blood spilled in the dirt, the man who had limped away, vowing revenge. But the land remembered. Jasper saw it in the way the wind carried whispers through the prairie grass, in a way Hannah's hands trembled for a heartbeat when a branch snapped outside. The past was a wound that wouldn't scab, a shadow that stretched long even in daylight. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the sky turned a bruised purple, Hannah paused mid-task, her flour-dusted hands resting on the edge of the sink. She didn't turn to face him, but her voice cut through the quiet, raw and unsteady. "Why didn't you let me run?" The question hung in the air, heavy as a storm. Jasper froze, his grip tightening on the shovel he'd been mending. How could he explain the ache that had lodged in his chest the moment she'd collapsed on the platform? The way her whispered plea, "Please don't let him find me," had reignited something he thought buried with Mary. How could he tell her that she'd become the antidote to his hollow, that her survival had fused to his own like two broken halves forming a jagged hole? He opened his mouth, then closed it again, the words too vast, too fragile to shape. Instead, he crossed the room, stopping just behind her. The scent of bread and sweat clung to her, mingling with the dusk. He reached past her, his hand brushing hers as he set the shovel down, lingering just long enough to anchor them both. "You don't owe me nothing," he said gruffly, echoing words from their first night. "This ain't about debts." He hesitated, then added, "But I reckon I needed someone to need me again." The admission hung between them, trembling like a spiderweb in the wind. Hannah turned then, her eyes wide, searching his face for the truth she'd carried since stepping off that train. What she found there made her shoulders ease, the tension in her jaw soften. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Outside, the land stretched endless and wild, its horizons blurring into the sky. But here, in this battered house with its crooked frames and patched walls, two shattered souls had begun to mend, not by forgetting the ghosts that haunted them, but by stitching their wounds together, one careful thread at a time. The cracks let in the light, and for the first time in years, Jasper didn't look away. The stars pricked through the velvet sky like pinpricks of defiance, scattering light over the endless prairie. Jasper and Hannah sat side by side on the splintered porch steps, their hands clasped in quiet triumph. The air hummed with the faint, rhythmic chirp of crickets and the distant, mournful yip of a coyote, a sound that seemed to echo the unspoken truth between them. Survival was never a guarantee, only a choice carved from grit and blood. Hannah's voice broke the silence, soft as the first blush of dawn. "It's enough." Her words hung in the cool night, fragile yet resolute. Jasper squeezed her fingers, his calloused thumb brushing the knuckles, grounding the moment in the tangible. Enough. Not perfect, not safe, but alive. The wind stirred the prairie grass, its whisper weaving through the broken fence posts and the leaning barn, carrying the scent of earth and resilience. It was a promise etched into the land itself, a testament to the fire that had forged them. Every nail hammered into the sagging porch, every splintered board replaced on the barn, every seed sown in the stubborn soil was a rebellion against the void. Jasper had once believed his life was a hollow shell, a relic of grief and dust. But now, as he watched Hannah patch torn curtains by lamplight or knead dough with hands still trembling from old scars, he saw the truth. They were rebuilding more than a house. They were stitching together a future, one defiant thread at a time. Hannah had found a man who would stand between her and the world that sought to claim her, who would bleed before letting her become a shadow of someone else's greed. And Jasper? He had found a reason to live beyond the weight of Mary's ghost. A woman whose survival had fused to his own, whose quiet courage reignited the embers he thought long dead. The West had tried to break them. It had hurled storms of violence, loneliness, and loss at their feet. But here they were, weathered yet unyielding, their hands roughened by labor and love. Together, they had become something neither could be alone, whole. Not because the past had vanished, but because they had chosen to face it head on, to let the fire of their shared struggle temper them into something stronger. The coyote howled again, its cry blending with the rustle of grass. A lullaby for the living, a dirge for the ghosts that still lingered but no longer ruled. Jasper tightened his grip on Hannah's hand, the warmth of her presence anchoring him to this fragile, hard one now. The land stretched endless before them, its horizons blurred by possibility. And for the first time in years, Jasper didn't look back. The West hadn't broken them. It had forged them, together, always.